This is a reading from Philotea, or An Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. So, Philotea, or An Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales, Bishop, Confessor, and Doctor of the Church, with an introduction by Father John C. Reville, S.J., Ph.D. The parting words of St. Louis, when on his deathbed, to his son were, "Make frequent confession, and choose thee a good confessor, who shall faithfully teach thee in the way of salvation." St. Francis de Sales. Nihil obstat, Joseph A. M. Quigley, Censor Librorum, Philadelphia, November the 5th, 1942. Imprimatur, D. Cardinal Doherty, Archbishop of Philadelphia, Philadelphia, November the 7th, 1942. An Introduction to the Devout Life was published in this edition by Joseph F. Wagner, Inc., New York, New York, in 1923, and again by the Peter Riley Company, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1942. The picture on the cover is from the most authentic portrait of St. Francis de Sales, painted in 1618, and now located at the Visitation Convent in Turin, Italy. But even as Josué and Caleb declared that the land of promise was good and fair, and that the possession of it would be easy and pleasant, so the Holy Spirit, speaking by all the saints, and our blessed Lord himself assure us that a devout life is a lovely, a pleasant, and a happy life. St. Francis de Sales. Introduction. The introduction à la vie dévotée is here offered, plus the title of Philotea, the name under which the original French of the work was published by its author, St. Francis de Sales, in 1608. It first saw the light just about the time Shakespeare was giving to the world Antony and Cleopatra, Captain John Smith, his true relation, Middleton, A Mad World. In the year of its publication, John Milton was born, and Quebec founded. It is not likely that at any time during his life the saintly Bishop of Geneva ever heard of the plays of the greatest of English poets, nor can we imagine that, man of taste and lover of letters though he was, he would have much relished the tempest and turbulence of passion as painted by the Elizabethan dramatist. Yet, like Shakespeare, the writer of the Philotea was an admirable psychologist, and could read and analyze character with unerring instinct. But Shakespeare did not move on the same plane of thought and vision. Francis lived in a world of supernatural ideas, and there is much, we imagine, in the world of the creator of Falstaff and the merry wives of Windsor, in the philosophy even of Hamlet, and the crudities of Timon of Athens, that would have shocked him. But long before Shakespeare's name had met with anything like general recognition, either from his own countrymen or more especially from circles abroad, before any foreign translations of his plays existed, L'Introduction à la vie dévotée had been known in almost every language of cultured Europe, and the saint's name and work were better known among Frenchmen and foreigners than those of the Englishmen in Cumberland or Lincolnshire. The Philotea wears well, like all great classics. It is now more than 300 years old, and though everything has changed around us, the very language in which it was written, the styles, fashions, and manners, the politics, the social fabrics of the time, it has still the freshness and vigor of its first youth. For the saints, who seem to be so cloistered from the world, and to look out upon it as might some holy nun through the iron grill of a Carmelite chapel, with ethereal gaze, and as in a waking trance, really understanding the world better than the worldling, they unerringly chart its course, and accurately take the soundings of its treacherous waters. They plummet its depths, far better than those whose bark is tossing on their restlessness. Their vision is clearer, their compass is more accurately set. Hence it is that any really great spiritual book has of its nature one of the first qualities required for a world classic. It deals in truth and power with the vital questions that affect the lives of men. It enters into the sanctuary of the heart. It brings light, the sometimes blinding light, of God's truth into the neglected shrine of inner consciousness, and sends the echoes of forgotten principles ringing through the awakened soul. Hence, the immortality of such a book as the Confessions of St. Augustine. Its author had sounded all the depths and shoals of human pleasure and triumph. The African rhetorician knew the world. He had tasted its emptiness. An honored, petted, and rose-garlanded guest, he had sat at its banquet table amidst wine and song. But with what Libyan, almost uncontrolled and fiercely burning passion, he bewails his follies and sins, his pride, the world's evil fascination. What lyric raptures over the goodness of a merciful God who saved him from its snares. The author of The Imitation of Christ, the Flemish recluse of the 15th century, is the very antithesis of St. Augustine. In him, the style, the thought, do not pour forth like molten lava from the panting heart. He is uniformly serene, calm, self-poised, and he writes like a hermit venturing abroad into the haunts of men, with hands thrust into the long sleeves of his habit, his head covered with enfolding cowl, with apparently unseeing eyes, with slow and rhythmic steps, a hieratic figure of meditation and solitude. But how he, too, knows the world, how well he reads the heart, what a diagnostician of the maladies of the soul, how gently, yet how ruthlessly he places his finger on the wound, hidden perhaps to ourselves, and with infinite tenderness and the sternness and unflinching sincerity of truth, love tells us almost with a smile, as if we were told something we already but too well suspected. Here, brother, thou ailest. Friend, here thou art dangerously ill. Here, be brave, my son, thou shalt have to apply the knife, to cut and to burn, for thy very life is at stake. Wisest of monitors and kindliest of friends, what treasures of heavenly lore, yea, even of true worldly wisdom, hast thou stored in the pages of thy little book? To the Imitation we must add another little volume dear to St. Francis de Sales, and which he is said even to have preferred to it, The Spiritual Combat of the Theatine Lorenzo Scupoli. Nor must we forget The Sinner's Guide by the Venerable Louis de Granada, The Names of Christ of the Venerable Louis de Leon, nor the Drill Book of the Soldier of Christ, The Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius, that made as many saints, as Francis de Sales used to say, as it contained letters, nor the Christian Perfection of Alfonso Rodriguez, the manual on whose solid precepts so many seculars and religious have been trained. At no time in the history of the Church have masters of the ascetic life failed to point out its principles, its end, and the practical methods by which it must be attained. In the very age which saw the germ of widespread spiritual decay in the lives of Catholics, while Voltaire was undermining so many things sacred by his sarcasms and sneer, St. Alphonsus de Liguori was writing those masterpieces of asceticism which still guide thousands in the pursuit of holiness. The spiritual book, the Philotea, now given to our readers, is from the pen of one of the greatest men of the 17th century in France, and one of the noblest and most lovable saints in the Church of God. Francis de Sales was born at Thorens in Savoie, August 21st, 1567, of a noble family, illustrious in the annals of his native province. His father and mother brought him up in the strictest principles of the Catholic faith, the more so as nearby Geneva, where the family counted many friends, was the central stronghold of Calvinism. The boy had for daily spectacle, and almost for playfellows, the snow-clad Alps, theme of Giraud's, Byron's, and Coleridge's song, ever sublime, ever fascinating, whether the bridal veil of the mists garlands their brows, or their bastions bear the burden of everlasting snows. The young nobleman's education was that of the youths of his class in the last years of the 16th century. His mother taught him his prayers and catechism. He made his first studies near his native place at the College of Annecy in Savoie, later under the Jesuits in Paris. To the study of rhetoric and philosophy, he added that of theology, scripture, and Hebrew. At the age of 20, the young man, handsome, cultured, and courtly, the perfect type of the gentleman of his time, went to Italy and heard the lectures of the famous Pancirola in the law schools in the law school of the University of Padua. The world smiled before him, pleasure beckoned him on, the highest honors of the state were dangled before his eyes. He made hosts of friends by his refined manners, his kindly humor, his eloquence, his wit, his unfailing kindness, and his all-winning gentleness and sweetness. He made enemies, alas, by his uncompromising fidelity to the principles of his faith, his scorn of all that was base, his loyalty to the standards of honor and purity he had learnt in the ancestral home. His enemies, thinking no doubt they might terrify him from the paths of virtue from which they could not wheedle him, set upon to cow him into submission. But the gentle Francis de Sales was not to be cowed by threat or blow, and when attacked by a band of assailants, he whipped out his rapier and drove his enemies in headlong flight through the tortuous streets of old Padua. Gentle Francis de Sales, yes, in truth, but he won the right to be so called because he had disciplined a naturally fiery temperament with the curb and bit of Christian self-control. The degree of Doctor Utriusque Juris of Civil and Canon Law crowned the career of Francis in dreamy Padua. Yielding for the moment to his father's wish, he accepted office before the local senate of his native province at Chambéry. Twice he refused the senatorial dignity. In 1593 he was named, while still a layman, provost of the Episcopal Chapter of Geneva, and the same year was ordained priest. His heart was now satisfied. If ever there was a priestly soul, it was that of Francis de Sales. His life was stainless, his character was balanced, his intellectual gifts were of a high order, his mental vision clear, his fancy playful, his imagination creative, his learning extensive. His love of God burned like a poetic flame. It was tender and childlike. It was the very breath of his apostolate. With an almost feminine tenderness, he loved all men, and because he loved them, he wished all to know and to love God. But he was strong. In his strength he was tolerant of men's weaknesses, of their peculiarities, their narrow views, their whims, their oddities, their ill-founded judgments, their inconsistencies, and their faults, provided only these did not essentially interfere with their solemn obligations towards God. He taught that a courtier might be a faithful attendant on his prince and yet serve God, that a woman might keep her social rank and defer to its reasonable demands and conventions, and at the same time preserve the grace of God in her heart. When he first preached to the mountain villages of the Chablais, his simple, popular eloquence, full of parables, homely allusions, and illustrations, won all hearts. He spoke to the people and for their needs. They listened to him with rapt attention and heard the provost's sermons with something like amazement. Never had the mountain folk of the Chablais ever suspected even that they could be spoken to in such homely, yet truly priestly and dignified phrase. Conversions from Calvinism became numerous, and the name of the young apostle was soon known throughout the length and breadth of France. Francis, although disliking controversy, held several conferences with the Calvinist Theodore de Bèze, but as they seemed to lead nowhere, they were soon abandoned. In 1602, he was appointed Bishop of Geneva, but the Calvinist capital offered but a cold welcome and limited opportunities for the evangelization of his immediate Catholic flock, and he transferred the main theater of his labors to Annecy, where he lived like any poor priest, and where he was left up to this day, a lasting and a fragrant memory. His work as bishop, as founder with Saint Jane Frances de Chantal of the Order of the Visitation, his labors as reformer of ecclesiastical discipline in Savoie and in France, his influence at court with Henry IV, and his son Louis XIII, his unbounded charity, his zeal for souls, his gentleness, and at the same time the heroism which he displayed in the most trying tasks, his unswerving fidelity to the chair of Peter, his contempt for the honors of the world, his constant refusal to accept from Henry IV and Louis XIII of France far greater honors than the Dukes of Savoy could offer him. All this belongs to the history of the Church in the 17th century. They need not to be recounted here, but they soon wore out the brave champion of Christ, who scaled the snow-clad Alps to seek out his erring sheep. Obedient to the orders of his sovereign, the Duke of Savoy, who had sent him on a confidential mission to Avignon, he stopped on his return at Lyons. There he saw Madame de Chantal, whom he had long directed in the secrets of the spiritual life and led to the heights of sanctity. Worn out by his labors and suffering intense pains, which he bore without a murmur, he here passed away December the 28th, 1622. The body of the saint rests in his beloved convent of the Visitation at Annecy. The Lyonnese kept his heart in their city for over a century and a half, but at the time of the French Revolution it was carried to Venice, where it is venerated today. Francis was beatified in 1661 and canonized by Pope Alexander VII in 1665. In 1877 he was proclaimed by Pius IX Doctor of the Universal Church. Among the saint's principal works are the Controversies, first printed as handbills and leaflets and scattered among the inhabitants of the Chablais Mountains, who neither could not or would not come to hear him preach. The saint was one of the first in modern times to use his peculiar 20th century publicity device for mission purposes. The Controversies form a popular treatise on the fundamental articles of the Catholic faith. The authority of the Church and the primacy of Peter are particularly insisted on. The defense of the standard of the cross exposes the reasons for the devotion to the cross and the meaning of the sign of the cross. It is a simple exposition of one of the most popular of Catholic practices. The treatise on the love of God is, with the Philothea, the one masterpiece which fully reflects the mind and heart of the Bishop of Geneva as those of a great genius and a great saint. The first 4 of its 12 books explain the theory of divine love, its birth, growth, perfection in the soul, and how it may be lost there. The 5th defines what is meant by the love of complacency and the love of benevolence. The 6th and 7th treat of the affective love, the 8th and 9th of effective love, which is naught else but submission and conformity in practice to the will of God. The last 3 books resume his teaching and suggest practical methods for its application to daily life. If, in the first part of the work, there is a little dryness when the saint enters into the explanation of the faculties of the soul, as the work proceeds, it rises into the realms of true mystic poetry, and its pages are clothed in the language of the purest lyricism, which caused it to be compared by Sainte-Beuve to the finest passages of Lamartine. The Philothea, 1608, may not in vastness of conception be the equal of the treatise on the love of God, but it is perhaps better suited to the average reader, and as a spiritual book stands in the very first rank of great religious treatises. In order that the memory and example of the saintly Bishop of Geneva might be still more honored than in the past, Pope Pius XI, on the occasion of the tercentenary of the saint's death, issued a special encyclical letter dated January 26, 1923. In that encyclical, Rerum Omnium, he solemnly designated St. Francis de Sales heavenly patron of Catholic writers and journalists. In the course of his letter to the Holy Father, the Holy Father refers to the book now edited, the Philothea, or Introduction to the Devout Life, and counsels the men and women of our day to read its simple, homely, but ennobling lessons. He singles it out with special and wholehearted approbation, so that we may well call it the chosen spiritual guide of the Holy Father. He is fully aware, no doubt, that it has a special mission in our own times, just as it had in the 17th century, and that it can bring both the priest at the altar and the nun in her cell, the statesman in office, the high-born lady of the world, and the humblest handmaid at her work, rich and poor alike, to the highest sanctity, provided they follow its golden lessons. Philotea, as its Greek etymology implies, is the God-loving soul. Any soul that sincerely wishes to serve its Creator and Lord in no matter what rank of society, under any circumstances of fortune, in any walk or state of life. The original Philotea seems to have been a lady of high rank, Madame de Charmoisy, equally distinguished by birth, fortune, and piety, whom the pious Bishop of Geneva had met on one of his visits to Paris, and in whom he found an apt pupil in the way of perfection. The Philotea, or Introduction to the Devout Life, is meant for all Christians. St. Francis himself tells us that too many spiritual authors addressed themselves in their writings to priests only, to religious men and women living under a special rule that obliged them to aim at a higher perfection. These authors did not address the vast majority of their brethren, who had no other guide but the gospel. They had cloistered the principles of sanctity and made asceticism a closed book to them. Yet our Lord had preached that perfection was meant for all men. He had ended all to perfection. He had called all to perfection, that perfection at least which they might attain in their various states of life. Be ye perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. It is the special merit of the Bishop of Geneva to have opened the two rigidly barred gates of asceticism, to have given asceticism, devotion, an open entrance into the court, the camp, the farmhouse, the fashionable salon or parlor, the workshop of the laborer, to have taught with unsurpassed authority, sweetness and charm, that the very height of sanctity and perfection might be attained by any man or woman who, in the fear of God and his love, fulfills all the duties of the state of life in which his lot has been cast. In the Philotea, then, Francis intends to lead the soul living in the world on the paths of devotion to true and solid piety. It is an error, a heresy even, says the saint, to hold that piety is incompatible with any state of life. In the first part of the book, the saint helps the soul to divest itself from all affection to sin. In the second, he teaches it how to be united to God by prayer and the use of the sacraments. In the third, he drills it in the practice of virtue. He then strengthens it against temptation and finally teaches it how to form its resolutions and to persevere. The introduction is a masterpiece of psychology, of practical morality, built upon the solid foundation of the gospel and the teaching of the fathers and great ascetical writers. Philotea is addressed, as we have said, to every rank and class of society, to the religious, the priest, the nun, the artisan, to the widow, the mother, the bride. It is written with the directness, the plainness of phrase and allusion characteristic of the saints, and which at times might shock an over-fastidious ear. But the holy bishop looks at life steadily and sees it with the purified vision of a stainless soul, simple and solid. It is also clothed with that incommunicable charm of the great writer, as Newman says, who has something close to his heart and must carry it in its entirety to his readers. It is no wonder that Pius XI singled it out as peculiarly appropriate to the needs of our present society. Few other books teach the lessons of the gospel with the same authority and charm, and are so eminently practical. St. Francis is not only a master of the spiritual life, he is a great writer, and one of the fountainheads undefiled of the noble French literature of the 17th century. He is, by his quaintness, simplicity, richness of imagination, and originality of thought, by his sprightliness and picturesqueness of phrase, the connecting link between Montaigne and Amyot on the one hand, and Fénelon and La Fontaine on the other. There is a winged grace in his words, a twinkle, a joyance, subdued and tender in his eyes, that immediately disarm the most critical reader. His French, like that of La Fontaine, loses its delicate aroma even in the best translation. His letters remind us of those of Saint Teresa, The curling iron has not given them that too artificial, if graceful, Marcel wave sometimes seen in those of Madame de Sévigné, but they are as French in their freedom, simplicity, and grace as those of Voltaire, Joseph de Maistre, or Louis Veuillot. Les grandes pensées viennent du cœur, wrote the Marquis de Vauvenargues. The heart of the Bishop of Geneva was filled with the love of the beautiful and the true. God, for him, was beauty, truth, and love. The noblest thoughts sprang from the rich soil of his generous nature. He expressed them with the spontaneity of a child. Like a child, he loves to talk of marvels and strange beasts, and relying too much on Pliny and old bestiaries, he draws many of his illustrations from the natural philosophy of the Roman writer, and charming though the illustrations be, modern science must reject the foundation on which they rest. He loves to speak of doves and bees, lions, partridges, phoenixes, unicorns, and salamanders, says Gamaliel Bradford in his appreciative essay, Portrait of a Saint, included in his volume A Naturalist of Souls. Plays a large part in his menagerie, and his botany is too often in a class with Falstaff's chamomile. Honors, rank, dignities are like the saffron plant, which the more it is trodden on, the faster it grows. Yet we read it all with never failing delight. Mr. Bradford's essay reminds us of Leigh Hunt's delightful essay on the Bishop of Geneva, the Gentleman Saint. The title, however, is an unhappy one, for no saint, whether Simon Stylites or Benedict Joseph Labre, can really deserve the name that does not also possess the essential characteristics of the gentleman, even though he might not know all the complexities of modern etiquette. St. Francis de Sales has found no enemies. A Protestant sovereign, James I of England, one of the scholars of his age, said that he wrote more like an angel than a man. Great French critics and littérateurs, from Sainte-Beuve to Straussky, Henry Bordeaux, and Amédée de Margerie, Lanson, Brunetière, and Fauget, linger with delight over the polished, yet homely and simple ease of his phrase. Like Samuel Johnson, Francis had his faithful but fortunately not too prolix Boswell, and in L'Esprit de Saint François de Sales, his friend Camus, Bishop of Belley, painted an intimate portrait of a great servant of God, whose winning smile, tender words, humility, sweetness, and charity won countless souls to a newer and fuller understanding of the service of God. Through the Philotea, St. Francis speaks to the men and women of our own times. Those who will read the book will heartily re-echo the wish of the Holy Father. Would that this book, the most perfect of its kind in the judgment of his contemporaries, as it was at one time in the hands of all, were now read by all, so that true piety might everywhere flourish again, and the Church of God might rejoice in seeing sanctity common among her sons. John C. Reville, S.J.